welcome to Otherland's Editing Podcast, where two speculative fiction writers and editors help you craft fantastical worlds by keeping an eye on exacting editing and foundational writing principles. Every 2 weeks, we bring you interviews with other writers, advice on editing and writers' craft pitfalls, and reviews of popular media to help you grow. So sit back, relax, and join Margaret Bates and Midnight Boss as we discuss all things writing and editing. Hi, welcome to the next episode of the Otherlands Editing Podcast. I'm Margaret Bates, coming with you today with Midnight Boss. And do you want to tell them what our theme for the day is, Midnight?
Oh, do I? It's Groundhog's Day. Yeah.
Sure.
So we're going to be talking about the time loop phenomenon in fiction.
Yeah. And I think the best way to start it off is by building off of the framework from Groundhog Day, the 1993 Bill Murray comedy written by Harold Ramis. In case people haven't heard of it or seen it before, it's pretty common as a trope. And I think most people tend to understand that the first big place people remember seeing it in pop culture. I'm not saying it's the first time loop movie, I'm sure it's not, or the first time loop book either. But the one that people keep thinking about is always Groundhog Day, because then if they see an episode of Buffy or an episode of Smallville or whatever, or a different movie that runs on that premise, they go, oh, it's like Groundhog Day, but so it's ubiquitous. It's pretty straightforward. It's not a movie summary in this particular episode, but in case for some reason you're Amish, which welcome to podcasting, or you haven't seen it before, it's basically this really grouchy weatherman goes to cover literally Groundhog's Day in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, and he gets trapped in a time loop where every day is Groundhog Day and he can't figure how to get out. So he goes through a bunch of emotional moods and does a bunch of different things until he can finally get out of the loop. And it breaks down into different montages because he does different things depending on how either hopeless or nihilistic or whatever he is when he's in this loop working through it.
Yeah, and you see those reflected in other parts of the time loop canon, where you have the different moments as they work through how they're responding to what's going on. Some characters will have that moment where they're like, nothing I do matters. Let me break all the laws and behave as atrociously as I possibly can. Then they have, not all of them will still have the suicide montage, but even Palm Springs refers back to the montage of, well, I just tried to get out of this as many ways as possible before they actually submitted to having some character develop.
Yeah, and not all of them, quote unquote, do the suicide loop like that you said on screen, Palm Springs, which we'll talk a little bit more in a second. They just allude to it. You don't have to watch it. And then Happy Death Day, because she's being actively stalked in a slasher movie style, she's getting killed every day regardless and trying to stop it. But I will say that the original Groundhog Day does cycle through different ways that Bill Murray's character either copes or doesn't cope in the loop. And the first part's the disbelief. The second part is I can do anything I want to, which starts small with like eating everything in a diner, going to crime sprees. And then eventually he does get in that groove of if everything I do doesn't matter. There's definitely the depression where for a while he tries to kill himself, like jumping off buildings and driving off a cliff with a groundhog that he stole with him. And then in his case, he cycles through the I would like to have sex with women, so I'll just use the fact that I'm trapped in a loop to learn everything about them each day and then create these perfect date scenarios. And it's a mess. But eventually he gets to the point where he genuine, I think, wants to improve himself and become a good person. And he starts helping everyone in town and helping the local homeless person try and make his last night on Earth better because the homeless person always dies at the end of the Groundhog Day loop. And just becoming a better human. And eventually, spoilers, but this movie is literally 33 years old. That's how long it's been. Oh my gosh, the 90s are a long time ago. When he becomes an actually really good person, the loop stops and he finally can escape.
Some guys will just be out there going through a whole time loop scenario before going to therapy.
Kinda, yeah. It's sort of he has to work on himself. And I think in this case, part of it is, Lord help me, when he realizes the person he really wants to get with is his producer, played by Andy McDowell. And at first, it really is sleazy, and he really just wants to bed her. And eventually, he gets to the point where he respects her, and because of her, he does want to start being a better person. But I think he makes a genuine, not just for her, shift in his mentality when he realizes that every day for Groundhog Day, he can do whatever. He's essentially immortal while trapped in this loop. But that poor homeless fellow that he helps every night, this is it. This is it for him. And I think that helping him
Yeah.
and seeing him die in the hospital and going, not today, and giving him those days every time where his moments are getting him soup and giving him comfort, like it makes him legitimately start really wanting to be a better person for himself as well. So I think if it had only stopped with this woman inspires me to be a better man, it would have been a lot more facile. But we were both hands down super honest as we were watching it when he got to the interlude of trying to help the homeless man on a loop. We teared up a little bit. So I think as a writer, Harold Ramis was smart enough to know there had to be a deeper, he actually wants to help other people because he's realizing he wants to help other people and be like attached to a community. But in that case, and in a lot of, not everyone, but I think a lot of TV episodes or movies that have come after, not all of them, but some of them that tend to use that loop, either people think they have to become a better person and that'll fix it, which it doesn't necessarily, or some of them do really ape that part where to get out of the loop, you have to be a better person.
What it comes down to is that this is something that is not real and essentially a metaphor that you can use for whatever you like. But we do recognize that there are common ways, as you said, to use that of do this many times until you level up your personality. But it isn't the only way that it is used. It's just you as the writer determining what that particular piece of magical realism that you're going to use is going to do for the characters, how it's going to tie into their journey.
I think that's important to point out because the next thing we saw or reviewed in the prep for this was this 2020 movie on Hulu called Palm Springs, which is Andy Samberg's trapped in a loop, and so eventually he drags in Christina Milioti's character. And they actually allude to the like she thinks if she just has one really good day where she's nice, I guess, to her sister and her family, she's stuck at her sister's wedding, so it's her sister's wedding on a loop, that it'll fix it. And it doesn't. And Andy Sambergers tells her the whole day that I've tried that. You're not gonna get out of here by just being a nicer person. So it literally takes the fact that it knows metatextually that usually the trope is used and the metaphor is used to be, I just got to be a nicer person. And that's not how they solve that problem in Palm Springs. If you want to make your metaphor in that case, not I need to be a better human being and like be better for my fellow man. In her case, it's more, yeah, she should stop being as cruddy, but she improves herself by also literally teaching herself essentially, I guess, quantum physics.
Yeah,
Not astrophysics, but like quantum physics.
yeah, because her self-improvement really comes about because she just has to figure a way out. There's not going to be a magical thing where she achieves this and she will be transported out the next day and get to live her life. It's just you're stuck here forever unless you do it yourself. So she's the one who becomes proactive to do that after she finds out certain things that happen. Whereas Andy Samberg's character is just content to kind of live the same day over and over and say, okay, well, I guess this is my life now.
And I think for him, it's not just that he's content. It's also, I think he's afraid. Like he's afraid because he's used to this loop, whether it's good, bad, or boring. But if he
Yeah,
goes
yeah.
back to the real world, he has to try. And I think she points that out to him. So the metaphor for this is you have to save yourself sometimes for her, but for his character, it's like you have to face the real world. You have to go back and live your life, and life is messy and complicated and changes, and you can't stay stagnant. In his case, just chilling in someone else's pool for the rest of like eternity. So I think that's different. And it's interesting because there are three characters who are caught in this loop, who are kind of focal characters, that each of them brings a different metaphor or how they learn to cope with it until Christina Milioti's character figures out quantum physics and can help them escape. But the third person is this dude he drags in named Roy, and Roy is very upset. He's been dragged into a time loop forever. And so he spends every like other week or every third week or whatever it is in like loop time finding ways to torture and kill Andy Samberg for dragging him into it. But towards the end, they make peace and he says, I'm stuck, but I'm stuck in a day where I get to hang out with my son and my daughter's going to do this thing with me because he has like smaller kids, like middle school age kids. And my wife's here and we're having a cookout. And he's like, if I'm going to be stuck in a day, even if I can't ever see them grow up, at least I'm stuck with a good day with my family. So he makes peace with living literally in that moment and appreciating the people he's still connected to, even if they don't realize it never changes. So
And that's
also,
important for his character because when he meets Andy Samberg's character, the first thing he said is something really negative about marriage. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like marriage sucks, right? And then he's come to realize he's upset that he doesn't get to continue living his life with his wife and his children, and he's not going to get to see them grow up. So he's come to value what he still gets to have.
yeah, he's almost like a boomer type character. I mean, J.K. Simmons is obviously older than the other two actors by a bit, but it is very much in the beginning that boomer humor of take my wife, please. And then he actually comes to really appreciate his family. So again, even if you compare between the two movies and the four different characters trapped within their loops, what the metaphor is trying to do, or the magical realism in these cases is trying to do, is get them on their journeys, but all four of them have different journeys they have to take. It's a mechanism, but each thing they learn or grow with dynamically is completely different and sui generis to that character. Then we get to the slasher film, Happy Death Day to Me, which is a little bit more interesting because most of these movies have a or an allusion to, well, I tried to kill myself and even that didn't work. But in that one, basically a sorority girl gets caught in a loop where a serial killer is trying to kill her and succeeds every day on her literal birthday. And when she gets stabbed or blown up or choked or however she dies each day, she wakes back up in her bed and has to start over again. And she can't get out of the loop until she figures out who's trying to kill her and stops them.
She does have her moments of there are no consequences, though. There's a very nice scene where she decides to do her walk of shame entirely naked that day. And
Yeah,
she
that's pretty
looks
funny.
real happy. And it's just, she's like, yeah, look at it.
I mean, she definitely has moments where she's like, screw it, and does whatever she wants or says whatever she wants because she knows it's just going to reset anyway. I think what's interesting is, and you were pointing this out when we were pre-showing, so to speak, it's just that by picking the birthday, they're already picking a day that kind of loops because it comes once a year and it has its own like connotations and memories with it. Do you want to elaborate on that too?
Yeah. Her issue prior to this is that her mother died a few years ago on her birth. So we know from the first day that she lives, like she's ignoring her father. She doesn't want to go meet with him. She doesn't love her birthday at all. And that's because losing your mother is going to be traumatic. Losing your mother in early adulthood is going to be traumatic. That's bad enough. So I know generally in May, when this happened, it may not immediately trigger for me that this is the day, but I know when it's coming up and you have emotions associated with that. But when it's on your birthday, it's going to put a bullseye on that every year. Like you have to think about it every year, and then you think about all the things that you did with her on that day every year. So it really ruins it for her and makes it so that it's re-traumatizing every year. So she's already in a loop in that way, but refusing to face certain things about it. So it was a smart time to put that because then the metaphorical loop and the actual loop are colliding.
And then it's a little bit more torturous for her because her brother and herself literally shared the birth. Her mom was in labor with her and gave birth to her on her own birthday. It's doubly laced as a day where she has no choice but to think about her mother. Just makes it even sadder that she can't, in the beginning, bring herself to sit with her dad or really communicate with her dad because then it's like he lost both of them when he lost her mother. So
Yeah.
that's hard. And Tree, her name's Teresa, I think, but she goes by Tree, as I guess you do, um, is pretty much a crappy person. Like when they start she's no one's Bill Murray bad, but she's a pretty crappy person. She's been having an affair with a professor, which is not her as much as the professor is taking advantage of many girls on this campus, clearly.
Maybe he can have his own death day.
He should. And, she's rude to her roommate. She's not really great to some of the other sorority sisters who are kind of jerks, most of them, but she's just a hot mess all over. So figuring out that she's a hot mess isn't the key for her to get out of her loop with the slasher killer, but it is something she does realize organically as she keeps repeating the day and thinking about how many cruddy things she's done and cruddy things she wakes up to where she's made consequences that she breezes over, but they still exist. The
Well,
cheating
it's
she's
because she
doing, all
has to
that
come
stuff.
up with a suspects list of who would want to kill me. A lot
It's
of
long.
people because I'm terrible.
Yeah, that's the part that's really interesting is if she doesn't solve who's trying to kill her, she can't stop. So yeah, she has to go through this whole list of most of them, obviously, because the movie doesn't end 45 minutes in, who are red herrings. But yeah, she does realize how many people she has seriously made angry enough to kill her. And I think that is a life pause moment of, gee, I was sad for 3 years because my mom died, but now I've turned into a cruddy person and everybody wants me dead.
Think of a
Reason
single
too.
person who would want me dead personally. I mean, I'm sure there are politically individuals who would like to off me as a category, but I don't think any if people individually would be like, ah, that person wronged me so badly, I'm going to murder them in intensively creative ways. But when you have a whole list of people who might actually want to murder you, then maybe it's time to revoke.
And she does solve her murder and she does stop that person from killing her. I'm not going to spoil it because it's fun. But I think, and it's not germane to how this plays out, because in her case, yeah, she finds it by finding the killer. But in the process of it, she does have to go through facing who she is as a sidelight. And then eventually, once she's out of the loop, reconnecting with her father. But also, I think, and you pointed this out too, is that most of the time, the time loop doesn't have an effect to your physical body because it literally really does reset. And you've seen in like Groundhog Day, like I said, he jumps off a building. I think in Palm Springs at one point they get desperate and she drives their car into a semi truck, like huge explosion. Don't feel a thing. But for Tree, that's not true.
Yeah, as you said, it's not like you have infinite lives. It's like you're a video game character and you only have so many lives, and after that, who knows what's gonna happen? Is she gonna keep reincarnating until she can't move? Like,
Yeah, because literally she's in the hospital once because she passes out or she feels terrible about 10 days into the loop for her. And the doctor who's treating her says, you should be dead. I'm looking at like your scans and your x-rays, and this doesn't make sense. One of the times she literally got hit by a bus earlier on, but like her body keeps registering that pain. And so I think it was a smart way to have a loop movie for them, but to keep an urgency in it. Because normally, okay, if she doesn't solve the murder, she just gets killed every day for 10,000 years or whatever. But if she doesn't find it, yeah, you're right. Does she just keep being in pain? Does she become essentially comatose but relives the day? All of that kind of stuff. It's interesting that it puts more stakes in it for her physically than a lot of these other stories do. You mentioned when we were talking about it before, one of the TV shows examples that we could think of between the two of us, even though it's been maybe even 20 at this point, is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and season 6 has an episode where she is trapped in a loop.
yeah. So in this episode, it's not even the full episode, her time loop. It's just like a segment of the episode. It didn't get even that much. So we don't need to know the mechanism by which it happens. We know because her current antagonist did something. They're trying to test her in various ways. And in this case, they're like, okay, well, I'm going to put her in a little time loop to see if she can figure it out. What she has to do, they put her to work in the magic shop because they're like, you're not really doing anything with your life, Buffy, after we resurrected you from the dead and made you pay all the bills that we ran up. So we're going to put you in the magic shop and you're just going to have to sell things to people. It's fine. So they have a customer who comes in who's impossible to please. She wants a mummy hand. And every time Buffy goes to sell her that hand, either the hand chokes her to death, or she has to stab it to get it there, or it chokes the customer. And in the section of the montage, she's crying, like whatever. So it's metaphorical, but not in a way that she needs to change personally. It's metaphorical in that it is reflecting her emotional state in that season, because a lot of the depth of the season comes from her depression after being resurrected and basically ripped out of heaven. And the ways that people around her can't connect to her, can't help her, won't help her, and they don't understand what she's going through. But like she's at this moment where it seems like, well, everyone's moving on and people are doing things and they're passing me by, but I'm stuck in the same place. And it comes out in two different ways in that episode, time-wise. Like the earlier part in the episode, they have her at college, and then the time just zips by, and then suddenly other people have done other things, and she's still standing there. So they had that one, and then they had the loop, and both of those things are coming together to reflect on her mental state as well as doing that WB monster of the week kind of thing.
Yeah, I think one thing to think about is I guess it's been a long time since I've rewatched Buffy. And I know the episode, but I forgot exactly the context of what she had to do in the magic shop in that loop. But
Mhm.
as you were describing it to me, I'm like, that
It's
feels
a
like
lot of
every
hands.
day for someone who's ever worked in customer service or in retail, where you're like slightly different interaction with the customer, same crud, different day. So it's very relatable. I remember also in that season, and it's not that episode, but there's an episode where Dawn has the realization, and it's not Buffy, it's Dawn, where she might have possibilities. She's only like 15 and she's just starting high school and go off and get like a good job. But because of the way Buffy has had to, be dead and be the Slayer and had to drop out of college to take care of Dawn, that she'll, for now, it looks like in that season, kind of go from one cruddy job to another. Don't even get me started on Double Meat Palace working for fast food, which is my least favorite episode of the entire series, by the way. Even more than Seeing Red, which says a lot about how bad that episode is. But there's that realization that because of the duty of both the Slayer and essentially being Dawn's only caregiver, that Buffy's life has been sidelined as far as having a career, having the kind of trappings of adulthood. This season, whether it comes to fruition or not, Xander and Anya are supposed to get married. For a while, it looks like Willow and Tara are having a really good relationship and are both still at college. And so Buffy really feels left behind on so many ways because she is kind of just stuck being the Slayer, but also not having anything for herself.
Yeah, it's the amount of things that she has to sacrifice that mean that she doesn't get to progress in her life.
Exactly. It's really hard. Again, that's like you say, it's a metaphor, not about she needs to be a better person because it's not. They're just testing her. But it is a pretty good metaphor for how everybody else gets to progress and have, or at least plan to have accomplishments in life, whether they screw themselves out of them later or not is not the point. But Buffy really is trapped by her duties, both to her family and as the Slayer. And since Dawn was mystically created for her to guard as the Slayer and became her sister, it's a thing. It is kind of all trapped around like as long as she is the Slayer, which is she endemically is, she can't have the kind of adult fulfilling life that she would have liked to have had.
Well, at least not under capitalism.
No,
I
no.
mean, if you talk about any of this stuff with people who were fans of the show still, then they're going to say, well, for starters, the council should have been giving her money.
Yeah, right. They seem to look like they had a lot of money. They had some posh weed clothes. What are they got a jet come in from England. What are they doing? They're not
So
the killers of
they
the
should subsidize
demons.
all the housing requirements for the Slayers. They should give the Slayers a stipend so that they don't have to work. They Her friends should also have money that they're putting towards her life because they lived in her house for the time
Yeah,
that she was gone. So back rent, Willow, pay up. But it's going a little off kilter to a tangent here. But the bigger issue is that she has to do this on her own and that she's doing all the sacrifices, and that's what costs her potential future.
exactly. I know that you were playing a video game lately that had also worked on sort of time loops as a metaphor, what it was doing for those protagonists. Do you want to talk about it a little?
Yeah. So if anybody's into the indie gaming, this game isn't that old. It only came out a couple of years ago. The premise of the game is essentially this is one of those turn-based combat party games where you and a couple of your other adventurers are at the end of a journey and you're about to go beat the final boss. Yay. But the problem is that your main character, Sifrin, is traumatized and emotionally cannot express his feelings. And so when they go in to beat the king, you die. But then you loop back and then you wake up and then you realize you're reliving the day. He does this over and over again, and it's a benefit in a way because it allows him to figure out the best way to defeat the king. But then, even after he defeats the king, he gets looped back. So he has to go on other quests to try and figure out what do I need to understand about these loops to have them end. Are there ways that I can improve my fellow friends' lives? And there is that somewhat element of if I do this, then I can improve everyone's life and I feel good. But then he loops back again And then he starts feeling manipulative if he does the same thing where he made them happy because he knows all their responses. So it ends up being this hard emotional grind as these things are going on over and over and he's trying to figure it out. I don't know if I want to spoil the ending, but like that part of the issue is that he can't open up to his friends. He never tells them during this going on what's happening because he feels like he has to take it on himself. And what it amounts to is watching someone in the time loop slowly lose their mind, and they're not going to get it back happily because it's the end of the movie. It's that they need help to get out of this loop because he can't express what he needs to express to get what he needs. And it's actually a really hard play. Like as when you get into they have different sections like act 3 and 4 when it's becoming apparent that you can't just do everything perfectly and then everything will be resolved. You see like the emotional toll on him and like his dialogue is changing as in his reactions or people are starting to see the stress on him. So it's useful in that way to have kind of a very simple premise and let's be real, simple use of resources because you only have the one dungeon to crawl through over and over again. But it is extremely emotional. I don't think I have ever sobbed through the ending of a video game before this one. So
Oh,
that will tell you something about it.
yeah. And I think in your case, from what I'm hearing, because I haven't played the games and not good at video games, but is that like part of it within that loop is he has to learn how to reach out however he can. I mean, I know it's a loop, so people forget, but like to his friends and learn not to shoulder a burden on his own, or else he can't expect anything to progress, but he can't expect his own mental state to continue to deteriorate without reaching for help.
Yeah, he doesn't do it himself. Um, he should, but what you should do is not necessarily what you're gonna do. So he doesn't reach out to them. They're gonna have to reach out to him.
Okay.
And that's where it's gonna end up is that eventually they're gonna have to reach out to him to figure out what's going on. As
But
it's
it's
gonna devolve until then.
still a connection, like without some kind of connection between him and his
Yeah, yeah.
friends and that honesty, it's not going to ever get better, which is actually a really important lesson for people to inculcate in everyday life because sometimes there are things that you can't solve on your own. And I think sometimes
Yeah.
if you're like in the metaphor of depression or something else, you feel like I can do this, I've got to do it on my own, I've got to be independent. And it just drags you down more under without that type of connection.
And the
Um,
loop encourages you to see this spiral downward of negative thinking as you keep trying things, but then you get caught in the feeling of I have to keep my mask on or I'm not going to be able to continue. And every time something like gets in the way, you'll loop back. He's stuck, emotionally stuck from the very beginning, and then the loop just makes it literal, where he can't. Then he becomes afraid to make certain moves because even though it will loop back and he gets angry and frustrated that they don't remember the emotional important moments unless he redoes them. Like it's hard to explain what
well,
goes on because it's complicated, but
all
is
those
that
touchstones or emotional moments are only exist to him.
yeah, which becomes frustrating. And as I said before, he feels manipulative if he tries to recreate them. But at the same time, he doesn't want to show them what's going on with him and force a change. I guess it's like you're caught between wanting something to happen, but being afraid to make those moves because something bad might happen instead, or you might lose them instead. Of what would happen if I reached out to this person and showed them how much I cared, but then they don't care as much about me. And then I would have to know that they don't care about me. He's got a lot going on in that little head of his.
Bless his heart. And then I guess the other movie that I saw on my own is a Hanukkah movie actually from Lifetime called Round and Round. And it's basically a Groundhog Day, but Hanukkah. This woman gets trapped in a loop and it's this being Hallmark, part of getting back out of it is involves romance. But the interesting part about this one is that the magical realism is situated in this family dreidel. And her grandma gives it to her that day, and she doesn't know it, but the dreidel is I suppose, this matchmaking or finding your predestined partner kind of thing. I don't know exactly, but once you're in possession of it, you relive the particular day until you find the person you're meant to be with. And she doesn't know this. She just knows she has to get out of the loop. And eventually, the person who starts helping her, who's a friend of her grandma's at the old folks' home, who he's a young person, but works part time at a comic book shop, so he'll actually believe her. Um, is eventually the person she falls in love with and becomes her boyfriend after all of this mishigas. But the funny thing is, once the loop does finally end, she sits down the next day with her father, who explained to her, yeah, that's how the dreidel works. We all do it. And she's like, what? So it's almost in that case, the metaphor is a rite of passage for the people of her family. And that's how they find their partners. Her dad did it to find her mom. And it's always on, by the way, the seventh night of Hanukkah. The next night when they finally progressed is the final night of Hanukkah. But her sister did it to find her wife, and then she did it to find her boyfriend. So it's just interesting to see that touch of magical realism where in this case it's like a matchmaking secret within the family almost, but they don't tell each other. Like they don't tell you this is going to happen. Her sister doesn't warn her, her dad doesn't warn her. I'm unclear if her mother knows this. I don't think her mother does to this day. But so it's like this family thing where they pass it down bit by bit. So I guess it kind of shares a little bit with that movie that came out a decade ago about the guy who can time travel and his father teaches him how to do it. And that one's ethically creepy. This one is more just I find someone eventually we end up dating each other. In her case, it's because he literally every day was helping her trying to escape from the loop till she did. So it's not like Bill Murray creepy of I'm gonna manipulate things to sleep with you. So that's good, but it is interesting that that was more like this is our family's secret of matchmaking, and here's the magical realism, the special dreidel that kicks it off. But I think the reason that I wanted to talk about, besides how you choose to use a magical realism or a preternatural or whatever type metaphor in your story or MacGuffin that gets you to that emotional journey, is that in all of these different movies, there are different ways this happens. And Buffy, the nerd trio, does it. So it's mad scientists essentially are acting on her. And the round and round, it's a magical family totem. That's it. That's all you need to know. That's all they know about it. Happy Death Day, you don't even know throughout the movie why she's in this loop at all. I've heard that in the sequel, it becomes clear that there's some sort of physics lab on campus doing experiments, and her problem was getting caught up in it the first time, and then she and her friends get caught up in it a second time. But people didn't like that one because A, it became more science fiction than horror, and it also became way more concerned about the science and the how of it than actually just telling the story and the emotional resonance. And then to round it out, in Palm Springs, there's some earthquake that happens, unveiling this cave that does something with particle physics, I guess. I'm not a physicist, so even pretending I can guess onto how that works. It,
Yeah, in the
what I,
video game, I'm not going to say what it is because spoilers, but it's a magical world. So part of finding out the magic of how it's happening is what you're going to find out
yeah,
through your loops.
and then in Groundhog Day, they don't tell you why he's in this. In the text of the movie, you never know. I have heard from IMDb and like I think the subreddit once that there had been an earlier draft of the story where Harold Ramis, the writer director, had written in that he had pissed off this lady who he had had like a one night stand with, and she's a witch and she cursed him. And he spends what they estimate to be 30 years in the loop based on how long it would have taken you to learn skills like ice sculpturing and French and playing the piano perfectly. You know, even if I don't know if it's cut from the film and shot or if it was just literally in an earlier draft and never made it to the final iteration. But either way, I feel like the story is better served that there is no reason for how this happened, that, oh, a witch did it. Like, it makes sense if you hear it in retrospect. Okay, yeah, he got cursed. That totally checks. But I don't think it added to the story or the emotional resonance of Bill Murray's character's journey if you'd known that he made a witch mad with a one night stand and she cursed him. It might have made it feel even sillier, honestly. But the point is, we've listed 6 or 7 different ways this all happened. Sometimes it's sciency, sometimes it's a witch, sometimes it's a family heirloom, sometimes it's magical, but we can't tell you exactly how. But what happens, the way it starts off isn't really important. Even in the one where it literally is based on quantum physics, somehow in Palm Springs, and even though one of the characters teaches herself quantum physics to be able to undo the problem, you don't get bogged down in like, here's a 20-minute lecture on how equations work because I am dumb. I'm bad at math. But like you see a montage for 60 seconds of her watching YouTube videos and reading books online, okay? Getting these lectures. So like you know that she knows how to do it. But none of these things go, I need to get my character to do this mystical or scientific thing that happens to them for the loop. So now let me focus for 20 minutes on the mechanics of this, or for the big chunk of the video game of the exacting mechanics of this. It's about the character being on this journey to get back out of the loop and the emotional ramifications on them. And that's why a lot of these stories, especially the original Groundhog Day, whether you like that one particularly, you can't argue that it hasn't been an archetype that's been borrowed over and over again in mass media since then, because it focuses on the character's emotional journey.
Yeah, I think in the end, it doesn't really matter what it is, unless it comes into contact with the genre that you're creating. Like any other trope that you might use, or whatever magical scaffolding device that you use to get your character where you want them to be, that device needs to be balanced with the characterization because that's what it's there for. You don't say, I'm going to write a time loop story about people being caught in time loops as them serving time for prison and go into 30 pages every so often explaining the science of it because we don't care. Maybe you could have a companion to your sci-fi series in which you explain all the science of it if you really just went out and got your degree in quantum physics and then decided to start writing fiction. There will be people who like this is how I worked it out, and then later on you can release those things. But like within the text of something, you're including in as much detail about the little MacGuffin as you need to proceed forward, really. And a lot of it, if you find out about it, really should be where the character is finding out about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, the round and round's a great example. Even when she gets the explanation, they're like, "Yeah, our family has a magic dreidel. That's what it does." And like, there's not more than about 3 minutes wasted on it at the very end after she's gone through 90 minute of emotional journey. And again, I still maintain that if you had known why Bill Murray was in the loop, it would have lessened the effect of what the loop was supposed to do. I think also because if a witch curses him for essentially being a player and a jerk, then you're like, well, I don't ever have to worry about being stuck in a time loop. Not that you would, but I think it takes the immediacy of the experience away from you because you're like, I didn't tick off a witch. I'm good. I don't need emotional growth. Um, but I
Yeah,
think
I
that's
think that's a good
important.
point about how the audience reacts to it, because if the audience generally doesn't know how it was created, then they're with the character trying to figure things out. He never figures things out. In Palm Springs, it doesn't matter because none of us really know how to solve a quantum physics problem.
Unless you
But
do, and then congratulations on being like a physics professor at MIT. I just think sometimes, and I don't read hard sci-fi, and sometimes I don't read high fantasy. I cop to that. I'm not, that's not my side of the equation. But I think sometimes when people especially are doing hard sci-fi or complex magic systems, which there is a place for that, but I think no matter how deep you are in a hard sci-fi book or a high fantasy or George R. R. Martin style high fantasy where he takes 30 pages to explain the banquet and all the food that's being made before the red wedding happens. Like, don't get so lost in the weeds of the how that you forget to go back to how it's affecting your characters and how they're experiencing and going through those emotions in the moment. Because that's what the readers are here for. As long as they understand, okay, this is what's happening. Okay, this is a time loop. Okay, we'll figure out as we go how to get back out of it or why it happened. It really is only as important as what it does as a metaphor that you're using it for and what it does to your character's psychological journey.
I think you're likely to see that in a lot of fantasy of like the issue with fantasy and world building and explaining how the magic works is that you have to balance it enough for the reader to maintain interest. And there are ways that we can talk about in a future podcast where you can generate interest in the reader getting to know these things. One of those ways is if the character is stuck and they need this information. So it can be used to good effect there if the reader wants to know because the character wants to know and we can't progress forward without knowing. So we got to figure it out. But otherwise, if you find yourself endlessly explaining how the magic system works up front, only because you know that you're going to break those rules, it's not really worth your time. Then it starts feeling like an episode of My Friend Lauren's Gonna Kill Me, Hunter x Hunter, where they explain all the rules and then somebody does something that doesn't work and then they spend 20 minutes explaining how they broke the rules. And I'm like, I have other things to do today. Like you were saying, let's tie it to character and give it function because you can explain the background of how things work endlessly, but that's not necessarily driving a story.
And this is not a time loop movie, but it is a time travel film that I'm about to allude to. So I'm going to lump it in here. But I'm a huge Back to the Future fan. I'm a huge Michael J. Fox fan. That's neither here nor there. But I've seen a lot of the behind the scenes documentaries. And one of the things they mention is even though you think from having seen the film, there are a lot more special effects shots than there's only like 30 in the entire film. Because really it's just when the DeLorean goes back, and then when the DeLorean gets hit struck by lightning goes forward again. It's it. Most of the story is just about a kid trapped in the 1950s trying to get his parents to like get together, which sounds gross if you think about it too hard, but it's only really about the emotional reaction of Marty discovering who his parents were when they were his age and being able to relate to them. And the story is grounded in understanding your parents when they feel so alien to you when you're growing up and they're actually in their 40s. But it's a movie where A, there's really not that much special effects in it to begin with. And B, the movie is, God, I'm old. It's like almost 40 years old. And to this day, the only thing I know about the DeLorean, which is the only thing anybody knows about the DeLorean, is it runs on plutonium to make a nuclear reaction because that makes the flux capacitor work. What does the flux capacitor do? It makes time travel possible. It's basically a tautology, like a circular loop. Well, what do I need? A flux capacitor. Why? It makes time travel possible. Okay. Um,
I think if
that's
you're
it.
writing an actual science fiction novel, you might want to get into it in a little more detail than that, but
Yeah,
not at the
characters.
expense of stopping the action.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying do it that blandly of it's literally a circular logic. But the funny thing about the flux capacitor is it in itself, I have no idea how the hell it works because I'm pretty sure to this day Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis don't know how it works. But the interesting part is when he explains that to Marty in the Twin Pines Mall parking lot, he has this big moment, Doc, I mean, where he like gets really proud and he says, I was hanging up a clock and I fell off the toilet and I hit my head. But when I came to, I had the vision of this, and this is my life's work, and I've worked up for 30 years. So, like, the emotional import of explaining why this is so important to him, because it's this really grounding moment for Doc when you just barely meet him, and now he's about to get shot by the Libyans, another story. But then when Marty's back in 1955, it's the way he gets Doc to believe him from that time period. Be like, this is what makes time travel possible. You just hit your head. But it's not even so much that the flux capacitor exists as much what it meant for Doc to relate that story in 1985 about the culmination of his scientific efforts for 3 decades. You get the pride he had in that. And that grounds you to that character both iterations right away. So that's also weirdly enough, even though it's a science moment, it's also a character moment for Doc. And that also makes me think of, because we've been talking about like when you're creating a magic system or science, and we've talked about it in the realms mostly of sci-fi and fantasy. Technically, Happy Death Day is a horror, but it makes me think, although this is not related to time loops in any way, but this horror movie that just came out last year, The Substance, not time loop related in any way. Basically, the whole gist is you get injected with a substance, and it causes you to essentially spawn out of your body a younger, more attractive version of yourself. You share consciousness. That's the deal. The movie's called The Substance, and the main character, Demi Moore, gets a flash drive that explains this is the substance. Here are 4 rules. The video about these are your rules for the substance takes about 2 minutes, and that's it. And there are very set rules she has to follow, but I don't know how the substance works. I don't know how it sort of semi clones part of your body and loops your consciousness together. No one sat down and taught me, I guess, genetics or abbreviated mitosis and meiosis. I don't know. But there's the substance and it does something. And then the rest is about Demi Moore's character's journey to reconcile in any way, having this younger, prettier, essential version of herself being lauded by the public as an actress.
We don't
And
even know who these people are who sell this stuff to her.
no
They could
idea.
be some kind of secret lab experimenting on vapid human beings just to use it for military purposes. It could be some aliens doing their school science project. You have no idea. And it is never revealed because it's not relevant to the plot.
Yeah, the only
Um,
way you communicate with them is there's a hotline where one man, who I think is also the narrator for the 2-minute flash drive footage, explains, well, you do this or you can return this. And when she picks up the new monthly materials and goo bags, it's a thing. She goes to this nondescript building with some essentially lock boxes in the end of this sketch alley, and you see the numbered lockers, and there's only two because she's only like the second person on the substance. But you don't even know who set up this locker. You know nothing except you use the substance, you follow the rules, or things go bad.
yeah. I think that what we take from this, and that also makes me think of Gremlins. Here are the rules: take care of the pet or die. So you've got these premises that we work with, and we consider how much our audience would understand and how digestible we want it to be. But at its base, we are trying to deliver exposition about the devices we're using in a way that will make them digestible and understandable. But then also, we're setting up specific rules so that you're never going to guess what happens towards the end of the substance, but so that people can have levels of expectations for how the world should work. And so they will understand when X that shit thing happens, then it's predicated based off of how they understood the world to work.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil too much of the substance. I mean, it's a horror movie. You know things aren't going to go all puppies and sunshine, but they are very careful to set up the few rules of the substance. And basically, one is you only take it once to activate what's going on with you, and the one split, and you have to switch back every 7 days. And that's supposed to be it. And if you violate those two rules, eventually, like Chekhov's gun's going to go off. And if you don't honor those two simple rules, you're going to be having a you're going to pizza when you french fry. You're going to have a bad time and things are going to go to hell later in the movie. Just like with the gremlins, if you feed them after midnight and get them wet, you're not going to have cute little mogwais anymore. You're going to have gremlins. So people also have these pretty simple rules set up so they know when they're violated, oh, it's only so long before the other shoe drops because you broke the instructions of the science or the mystical force. Kind of like it's not the same level, I guess, of severity, but like in Back to the Future, for whatever reason, one of the rules about the car is it has to be going 88 miles per hour when it gets the 1.21 gigawatts boost in like the lightning, whatever. And they asked Bob Gale, why is it 88 miles an hour? And he's like, it's just an easy number to remember. But if that doesn't get up to that number, and that's a big part of the third movie, then they're not going to go anywhere unless it's 88 miles an hour. But for the substance, you don't know who's doing this. You don't know. Honestly, I half suspect there are people who wanted this to go poorly and observed that after the fact. But
Doesn't seem
all
to
you
go
know,
well, but
yeah, it doesn't. But all you need to know is that if Demi Moore and her sort of counterpart, whose name is only Sue, the younger version, don't switch off every 7 days, or they try and use stuff like the activator again when they're not supposed to, it's going to go real bad. So you may not understand some of the things that are happening, which feel like a fever dream. You may not understand the science of how it works, and I don't think the person who wrote it does either. But it doesn't matter because as soon as they're not really splitting time evenly or whatever, stuff's going to fall apart. Again, just like if little Gizmo eats after midnight, stuff's going to hit the fan. So setting up those expectations, and you're right, when they get violated, people are going to go, okay, something else is going to go off the rails, is pretty important for setting audience and reader expectation.
and all of those are predicated on the very simple premise that there are costs and consequences to actions. So we took this out into magic systems. Everyone who has even a kind of a soft magic system is going to recognize that there are limits. And so often when you start building your magic system, you're questioning, where does the energy come from? Is it something inherent to the person, or does it come from outside of them? Okay, check that off. Or what consequences are there to using the magic? What are those? Figure those out. So then you have a couple of firm base level rules by which you and your reader know, okay, this person has to have their magic amulet with them, otherwise they won't have the energy to do it, or this set of circumstances need to be met or they won't be able to do the magic. And you build from there, because magic is usually a recipe of some kind where you have like the specific ingredients or words or circumstances for something to happen. But um that's all frosting, like that's additional. Like you set the basic rules in place and then don't violate those, just build upon them.
I feel like we're getting a little far afield from time loops, but I think it is important that the time loops come with their own set of expectations. Like
Yeah.
you figure out that until whether it's whatever the character needs to learn, whether it's quantum physics or to be a better person or who killed them, you understand as a reader entering into these time loops because you've seen them done before. That until the character gets that chunk of knowledge they need to break the cycle, it's never going to be broken. So, however, use that metaphor or archetype of the time loop, people have been conditioned because it's such a part of pulp culture and things and science fiction and fantasy that okay, characters trapped here. They've got to figure out what it is they need to know to break themselves out, whether it's emotional or being a better person or literally physical of I don't get this knowledge. I can't like create a nuclear blast and get myself out of this. That is the expectation of a time loop is this is going to keep going till this character figures out the mystery that they need to solve. If you started a time loop story and all of a sudden on day 6 they're just magically out of it, you'd be like, A, this doesn't make sense within the rules you set up for me, and you'd probably feel cheated.
I'm thinking of what it would be like if you had a time loop story where they randomly get caught in loops and then they loop, 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 and then they get out of it and then they go and they're like, oh no, I'm looping again. I
That would
don't
be
know what that would be. That would
horrible.
be really hard to write. But
Yeah, it would be very confusing. And I'm coming at this as someone who, again, I am being honest, doesn't read as many complicated magical systems or high fantasy or complicated hard sci-fi. And I know people appreciate that. People have that subset of sci-fi where it's almost like Tom Clancy in space, where you do get the very detailed examples of how the ship works and how it does this. I totally appreciate that. I come at it from a lot of background, literally in psychology. So for me, as someone who's been a psychologist, I just am always really taking it back to that level of something fantastical, something scientifically impossible in our world has just happened. But at the end of the day, how is that affecting the character? How is that putting stress on the character? How is it, driving the character's motivations? How is it driving the character's desperate actions? If something fantastical happens and then it doesn't really affect how the character is thinking or behaving, then was it worth happening at all?
it's true.
So, do you have
It's
any
like
other?
the is this anything test that you put to CW shows of like, is this anything? Did this have any impact? No, then why was it an episode? So like
Oh,
you're
that's
thinking,
me.
okay, if I put this metaphor in there and they had this happen, well, that's what the whole book is about. So then if it doesn't have any impact on them, then why did I bother? They're not
Yeah.
responding. That's not very interesting.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, most people want to go, because it's a vicarious experience reading in and of itself, because you want to identify with the character. If the character isn't feeling emotionally anything or really going through a journey because they're stuck in a time loop, or as we've also gone to other metaphors, they went back in time or they took a substance that is now slowly messing their life up. But whatever's going on, there should be some sort of emotional impact on the character. Okay, one last example, even though it's more for social commentary points, but like, okay, The Metamorphosis by Kafka, right? Guy wakes up as a giant freaking bug, like a giant cockroach, essentially. It's more of a pill bug, really. But it doesn't matter why he does. I think it starts with him literally waking up that way. Never
Yes,
explained.
it does. And he's
It,
like, man, I gotta get to work. That's his first thought. I need to get to work.
uh sorry, spoilers, but the book's like what, almost 90 years old. But eventually the book is how his family rejects him and they can't work with him, and he kind of sort of eventually desiccates from the inside out, trapped in a room or stuck in depression as a giant pill bug. But again, it doesn't matter that he wakes up one day as a cockroach. It's never explained how that happens. It's just about the emotional and socially isolating ramifications of basically becoming that thing in his life. Because Kafka just wanted to depress the hell out of you, and he succeeds in that book. When you're doing all this, set up the rules, make them clear, make it so this people have enough so they can understand, but always make sure you go back to what it costs the character and then how it's affecting the character mentally, and finally how you're using that metaphor to put that character on whatever journey you need them to be on. Make it work for you.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with me today, Midnight. And in a couple of weeks, we'll come back with another podcast. Thank you for joining the Otherlands Editing Podcast. Look for our next episode coming soon. And in the interim, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want more information or want to connect, you can find Margaret Bates and Midnight Voss at our site, Otherlands Editing. Until next time, keep writing and keep refining your words.